And welcome back to our second day reflecting on the theology of vocation. And today we're going to go right to the theology of vocation. And as you see in your handouts now, the basic title for my presentation this morning is Grace Upon Grace, a Theology of Vocation. And that's what I'm going to try to probe and reflect on this morning as we try to talk about a theology of vocation as a grace upon grace, to quote, of course, the prologue of St. John's Gospel. In terms of an introduction, I want to say that this presentation is one that I have given many times. The two presentations I gave yesterday, I prepared precisely for this assembly over the last several months. The one I'm presenting today, this morning, is the one that I present when we have our young adult conference back in Chicago, for these 35 or 50 young adults who come to talk about discerning their own vocation for service or ministry in the church. So I've adapted that presentation to you this morning. And looking back, I probably have been giving this presentation at our Catholics on Call Young Adult Conference for about 5 years. And I remember when I was first writing this presentation and reflecting on it and reading it and so forth, two recurrent images came to mind. I like to think not only in words and in ideas, but also in images. I think that helps an awful lot. I think you see that with my PowerPoints as well. But two images kept on coming to mind. And the first image, I don't know, you might be familiar with it, but it's an image of Russian nesting dolls. So these dolls that each one fits in the other. So you open up the large one, you can put the small one in, and I'll explain why this is the case. But when I went to Google Images, where I get a lot of my images for my PowerPoints, I found, of course, this kind of standard Russian, this set of Russian dolls. But then I began to see that there are a lot of variations in this regard as well. And so, for instance, I saw one of the Beatles nesting doll. That's really kind of interesting. And then I saw another one was Elvis, and, you know, Elvis nesting dolls. And kind of my favorite for a long time was Batman nesting dolls. And then I was giving a presentation for a more serious audience. You have to keep in mind I'm doing this for young adults, you know. And but I was doing a more serious audience, and I came across the papal nesting dolls. So the last 5 popes. And then I thought, well, I wonder if there are any Chinese nesting dolls. And so I went back and I found this. so this is it's an image of how the smaller, you know, fits into the into the larger. And the reason for the persistence of this image, as I was reflecting, is that vocation is not one thing. It's rather involves a number of aspects or dimensions. And this leads us to the second image that I had, which is my opening image, and that is a waterfall. And it's like, a waterfall where there are different layers, and the water flows down and hits these different layers. And I thought about this as kind of, God's grace just kind of overflowing in all these different dimensions of our lives, kind of like a waterfall that flows down over our lives. Often we think of vocation in a rather restricted way. Usually, when you hear, "Do you have a vocation?" you think of religious life. You think of priesthood. You might think of the married state, but it's often restricted in that kind of way. But I think really each of our vocations is a multi-dimensional reality. It's those different levels where God has graced us in our lives. And this is why a number of people who talk about vocation today talk about how we have to develop in our church a culture of vocation. That everyone in the church participates in this reality of God's grace upon grace, the multi-dimensional, the multi-level reality of vocation in our church. As one of my dear colleagues in Chicago, a Passionist priest by the name of Robin Ryan, writes, when he writes about culture of vocation, he says that creating a culture of vocation is really related to the challenge of creating a culture of vocation within the entire church, among all of God's people, whatever their age. Fostering a sense among all the baptized that God is active in our lives, inviting us to put our lives at the service of God's people. So I think, when we think about a theology of vocation, it's important that we think about it in this multi-dimensional way. And I hope that the Synod can probe that idea and also call the church as a whole to begin developing a culture of vocation. Vocations are not just for special people in the church, but it's something, with which the whole church is endowed by God's grace that's constantly flowing through God's people. So what our reflections this morning are going to try to probe is a first dimension, or a first nesting doll, or a first level of that waterfall, is that vocation is ultimately the deep call, the deep desire of God that all of us reach our full human potential. So the basic vocation is a call to be ourselves. And within that call to be ourselves, we are called to be baptized disciples of Jesus. That's the fundamental Christian vocation, is the vocation of discipleship that comes from baptism. And that within that, there's a call to a kind of basic states of life. The married state or the single state. And then within the call to be human, the call to be a disciple, the call as we choose then, so everybody is called to be human, all Christians are called to be disciples. Some Christians are called to be single, other Christians are called to be married, and within that, some Christians, married and single, are called to be ministers. to be either lay ministers or to be members of institutions of consecrated life, to be religious, or are called to ordained ministry. And then finally, this leads to the various ways that that these kind of vocations, or these kinds of calls, can be lived out in our lives as a teacher, as a pastor, as a musician, and so forth and so on. Now, I think it's important, you know, I'm a systematic theologian, and I love things in order, and this is a beautiful order, but actually life isn't always beautiful and orderly. It's sometimes messy and you know, not always in the clear order that theologians would like it. So I think it's important to say that our vocation comes not necessarily in this wonderful order of, you know, human and Christian and married and single and ministry and so forth. That, as I think I said yesterday, you know, the first vocation that I got was actually one of it was the last one. You know, it was actually that vocation to be a teacher, how I would live out my life. And then, you know, within that, I saw a vocation to ministry, a vocation to priesthood and religious life. And I gradually understood what it meant to be, you know, how to live these, not as a special person higher than others and so forth, but as a disciple. And you know, in the midst of all of this, I'm struggling to become a human being. You know, so it's a kind of a messy kind of thing, but I think if we talk about, you know, nesting dolls, the largest nesting doll in which everything is included is that call to be human. And then there's the call to be Christian, and so forth and so on. So you know, the main thing I want to emphasize is not so much the chronology of vocation, but the many-faceted, multi-dimensional aspect of vocation. Now, before I begin my reflection on these various dimensions, I just want to offer a definition of vocation. I mentioned it yesterday. It's a definition that comes from a book which is probably the best book I've ever read on vocation, written by a relatively young American lay theologian by the name of Edward Hannenberg. He teaches at John Carroll University in Cleveland in the United States. And his book is called, if you run across it, it's a wonderful book. It's called Awakening Vocation. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful book. It's not always the easiest read. It's very rich theologically, but it's really worth the effort to reflect on it, and it's a wonderful book. But you know, for all the sophistication and complexity of that book, Hannenberg offers a very simple definition around which he develops his book. And that is, as you see from your handouts, it's simply, God calls me, or we could say us, through others, for others. I think that's a simple but profound, a beautiful understanding of vocation. That vocation is the realization that God calls me, or God calls us, for others, through others. So our vocation, our call, is a gift from God, a grace that calls me first and foremost to myself, and it comes from other people. It's not just my own personal experience, but it comes from my community, it comes from my family, it comes from the church, it comes from a faith community. So our vocation is the gift of God that calls me to myself, but it comes from other people. And it's always for others. A vocation is never something for myself. It's always something for others. Wonderful Quaker thinker, kind of philosopher and educator, a man named Parker Palmer, says this in also a lovely little book that he has written on vocation. He says, go far enough on the inner journey, go past the ego toward the true self, and you end up not lost in narcissism, but returning to the world, bearing gracefully the responsibilities that come with being human. So when we really, truly respond to God's call, it's always a call for others. It's always a call for service. So vocation touches our deepest identity, but it's always something about others. If it's not about others, it's not a worthy vocation. If I just want to be, a musician for musician's sake, and it's not for, entertaining others and, giving beauty to others, it's not a real vocation. If I want to be a priest just to be a priest and not for service, that's not a real vocation. It always ends up something for others. Pope Francis, I think, says this beautifully too when he quotes in Evangelii Gaudium the Aparecida document that, of course, he had a great hand in writing himself as well, the document from the Latin American bishops from 2007. He says, we become fully human when we become more than human. When we let God bring us beyond ourselves in order to attain to the fullest truth of our being. So with this preface, with this definition and this little reflection on the definition, let's look first of all at the fact that God calls us to be ourselves. The first thing, as I've already said, is the call to be myself, is the call to be our deepest self. And sometimes we think, God has some kind of a secret plan for us that we have to figure out, and if we don't figure it out, it's at our own peril, for the loss of our souls or something like that. But this is not really true. A phrase that I love, and which we're going to also talk about this afternoon a bit as well, and even a little bit tomorrow morning, is a phrase that a professor of mine, when I was doing my doctorate, said over and over again in a course that he taught us. And that is, I mentioned it yesterday, but it's this idea that God's will is the heart's desire. That ultimately what God wants for us is what will bring us the deepest joy, the deepest happiness. That God's will for us is not, some kind of, going against everything we want. It might mean suffering, it might mean sacrifice, it might mean all sorts of things like that. But ultimately, God's will is the heart's desire. Or as Ed Hannenberg says, God's voice is not a trumpet or a textbook, but a kind of presence pulsing through us. And so if we're going to talk about vocation, and particularly our vocation to be human, our vocation to be ourselves, we need to be people who learn to pay attention, to pay attention to our deepest yearnings, where, as St. Paul says, God's Spirit mingles with our spirit. I mentioned yesterday Thomas Merton as one of my heroes, and someone was talking to me yesterday too about that, saying that it was one of his heroes, as he was one of his heroes as well. But Thomas Merton, in a famous line, says, to be a saint is simply to be oneself. You know, to be a saint is to be what God calls us to be, and what calls us to be is, you know, to our deepest joy. There's a famous passage in one of Merton's books, his book called New Seeds of Contemplation. It's one of my favorite passages from Merton, and he writes this: "A tree gives glory to God just by being a tree. For in being what God means it to be, it is obeying Him. It consents, so to speak, to His creative love. It is in expressing an idea which is in God and which is not distinct from the essence of God. And therefore the tree imitates God by being a tree. The more a tree is like itself, the more it is like Him. If I tried to be something else, it would give Him less glory." That's a beautiful, beautiful, wonderful passage. I think it expresses so well this first aspect of vocation. And I think this is wonderfully illustrated in a story I mentioned already, Parker Palmer, but a story that Parker Palmer tells about a Russian rabbi by the name of Rabbi Susa. And the story goes that Rabbi Susa says, in the coming world, they're not going to ask me why you were not Moses. They're going to ask me why you were not Susa. Karl Rahner, one of the great 20th century Catholic theologians, offers a great paradox in his writings. He says that nearness to God and genuine human autonomy, genuine human freedom, increase in direct and not inverse proportion. In other words, the more we become ourselves, the more we are open to God. You know, I think that's a powerful, powerful idea. And again, Ed Hannenberg, God calls us to respond by carrying forward our deepest identity, to be saints by being ourselves. Ed Hannenberg, in his book, tells a story of Karl Rahner and a young man in the 1950s wrote to him. He was very depressed and frustrated. He says, you know, Father Rahner, how can I get out of this depression? How can I, really be happy in my life? And Rahner writes back to him and says, we must accept ourselves as we are. But when we do this really honestly, courageously, and hopefully, we accept God Himself. So this first nesting doll, or this first layer of God's grace in our lives, is really the one that holds all the others. That God calls us to be ourselves in a world that's filled with grace, in a grace-soaked world. So we come to our second nesting doll, or the second dimension of vocation, which is that God calls us to be disciples. Again, I mentioned Parker Palmer and this wonderful little book. I can't remember the name of the book offhand, but it's a wonderful, 150-page book on vocation that's really very, very special. But at one point, he quotes a fellow Quaker by the name of Douglas Steer, who says, the fundamental question, who I am, inexorably turns to whose I am. Because there is no selfhood without relation. And for Christians, whose we are is Christ's. And this is because of our baptism. Baptism I think it's important to recognize, and we, theology recognizes this very clearly in these days, is not something in the past. It's not something that, I don't remember my baptism. I was baptized, I don't know, a week or 2 or 3 weeks old. I don't even know. I think what we have come to realize is that baptism is not something in the past. Baptism is something ongoing. It's something that we strive to live out every day. One of my colleagues at CTU, Richard Fragamini, says that we have to learn to live in a baptismal mode. And another one of my colleagues, Richard McCarran, says, we never dry off when we're baptized. We actually, as Christians, are the walking wet. Because the baptism is not something that just dries and we can leave it behind. It's something that we live every day. And so what I want to do here is to look at the baptismal ceremony and kind of go through it in slow motion. Of course, I'm sure all of us have performed, many baptisms in our lives, and we know the ceremony well. But sometimes it's good to kind of take a slow motion to see, the powerful symbols that are present in the baptismal ceremony. The first thing to look at is the baptismal font is, first of all, a tomb. This slide here is a baptismal font from the early church, probably about the 4th century in Asia Minor. When we are immersed in the font, as they were in those days, or when water is poured, we actually die and are buried with Christ. As St. Paul writes, "Are you not aware that we who were baptized into Christ were baptized into his death?" One of the great theologians of baptism in the early church was Cyril of Jerusalem, and he gave a series of what he calls the mystagogical catecheses in Jerusalem in the 5th century. And as he's talking about baptism in this series of homilies that he gave, he writes, "You were led down to the font of holy baptism as Christ was taken down from the cross and placed in the tomb." But while the baptismal font is a tomb, it's also a womb. It's the gateway to new life. Paul goes on in Romans 6 to write, we were indeed buried with him through baptism into death, so that just as Christ was raised from the dead, we too might live in newness of life. And Pope Francis in Lumen Fidei wrote that water is both a symbol of death and a symbol of life, of a womb in which we are reborn. I'm sorry. A womb in which we are reborn by following Christ in his new life. Again, Cyril of Jerusalem writes, I love that picture. It's just a wonderful picture of new life, isn't it? Saint Cyril writes, in the same instant you died and were born again. The saving water was both your tomb and your mother. And Paul writes, whoever is in Christ is a new creation. And Paul writes, because of baptism, I no longer live myself, but Christ lives in me. These are not just mere signs. These are rich symbols which expresses what happens in baptism. And then we have a number of what they call explanatory rites in the baptismal ceremony. The newly baptized person is anointed with oil. And as we know, in Greek, the word anointed means Christos. So what it points to is the fact that we not only belong to Christ, we're not just entering a community by baptism and, are companions with Christ, we have become other Christs because we have died and have risen into new life with Christ. As Cyril of Jerusalem says, as partakers of Christ, you are called Christ's anointed ones. You are likenesses of Christ. And the minister at baptism says when he anoints the newly baptized with oil, God now anoints you so that you may remain forever a member of Christ, who is priest, prophet, and king. And then the ceremony moves to the giving of the white robe and the candle. As Paul wrote, for all of you who have been baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free person. There is not male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And then the newly baptized, or if it's an infant, it's the godparents, of course, are given a candle so that, like Christ, they can be the light of the world. So all these symbols express what happens at baptism. What this vocation to discipleship is all about. It is to be another Christ in our world. And we could say a lot here, that as human beings, as called to be ourselves, we have then, as Christians, the basic call or vocation to continue the work of Christ in the world. Baptism is a call to mission. It's a call to work with Christ in continuing his work in the world. Showing forth, the salvation that God offers, the joy of the gospel. That wonderful line from Pope Francis early on in Evangelii Gaudium. A Christian must never look like someone who's just come back from a funeral. That this is the joy that as other Christs we are called to through our baptism. So this second nesting doll, this second level of grace in our lives, is that as a call to be ourselves is ultimately a call to serve, to be missionary disciples. And as Pope Francis says in Evangelii Gaudium, in virtue of their baptism, all the members of the people of God have become missionary disciples. So we move to the third level of vocation, or the third nesting doll of vocation, and that is that God calls us to a particular state. That we are called either to the married life or to the single life. And of course we know that it's important how we live out our vocation to be human, and how we live out our vocation to be disciples. And we can do it either as married people, raising a family, or as single people. Marriage, of course, involves this rich mutuality and companionship and sexual intimacy, and if God is good, parenthood. It's the sacrament of Christ's commitment and self-giving to the church. The single life is one, of course, that entails a life of celibacy. But of course that doesn't include, or it doesn't exclude intimacy and friendship. You know, everyone needs to have those deep kinds of relationships, those deep kinds of friendship and intimacy in their lives. One of the advantages of the single life is it does give us freedom for risky service of the gospel, which not always, some married people do, of course, still risk very highly in their own work. But a celibate life, a single life, gives us the chance to give ourselves in risky service of the gospel. And I think it's important, as I said yesterday, that we shouldn't think of the single life as just kind of a default mode. Well, if I can't find a man, if I can't find a woman to marry, oh, I guess I'm single. You know, and it's kind of like, oh, well, that's the way it is, you know, I'm not cut out. No, I think that it's a real vocation, and that people find real fulfillment, you know, in a celibate single life. And it's important to say that each one of these states, whether one chooses marriage, one feels called to marriage, or one feels called to the single life and celibacy, is an equally good state and equally holy. There are no levels of holiness in being Christian. You know, I mean, in terms of states, obviously, you know, all of us are at different levels of holiness. But I mean, in terms of states, whether we're married, whether we're single, celibate, you know, this is still a holy vocation, you know, and it's equally important and equally holy. And this takes us then to our fourth level, or fourth nesting doll of vocation, and that is that God calls some Christians to ministry in the church and in the world. We have to remember, though, that the fundamental Christian vocation is the vocation to discipleship. That all are called, first of all, to be fully themselves. All are called then to serve as missionary disciples, either as married or as single. And all are called to participate in the priestly and prophetic and servant ministry of Christ. All are called to holiness. As Pope Francis says, our great dignity derives from baptism, which is accessible to all. Some, however, discover their true identity, discover the true meaning of their lives, of their humanity, in another nesting doll, or another level of grace. And that is the call or the vocation to ministry. It doesn't make them better Christians. It doesn't make them closer followers of Christ, because we're all equal because of our baptism. But it does make them distinct within the Christian community. And it offers particular possibilities for living out their humanity and living out their baptismal commitment as married and single. Now, there may possibly be more ways of speaking about ministry in the church, but traditionally there are three ways that we speak of ministry in the church. First of all, the lay ministry. And that is open to married people, or it is open to single people, or religious or consecrated life, which is, of course, only open to single people, those who have chosen a life of celibacy. And it involves, of course, community and the taking of certain vows. And then there's ordained ministry, which is the leadership of Christ, the sacrament of the headship of Christ in the church. One can be a permanent deacon and be married and called to this ministry, priesthood and episcopacy, at least in the Latin Rite, ordinarily involves celibacy. As we know, we do have married priests and, former Anglican priests and so forth, but ordinarily in the Latin Rite, to be called to priesthood is also to be called to a single celibate life. But let's, and some of these ministries are certainly more responsible. Certainly, Bishop Michael's ministry is more responsible than a lector in one of our parishes, On the other hand, each is equally important in the church. Each has a place in the body of Christ. Each has the same dignity as people who are disciples called to ministry. And I'm going to talk about, first of all, lay ministry, and then religious life, and then priesthood, but I'm not going up a kind of hierarchical scale. The logic of order that is here is one that in lay ministry, all disciples are eligible for lay ministry, married or single. For the consecrated life, only those called to the single life are eligible, but women are eligible as well as men. And in terms of priesthood, according to the teaching of our church, that only celibate, ordinarily celibate and always males are called to ordain ministry in the church. So I'm going to talk about each one of these briefly, but it's not. I'm not, as I say, going up a hierarchical scale to say one is better than the other. It's just that some are more. One is more accessible. Some are more accessible than the others for Christian disciples. So we talk about lay ministry. All lay people, and this is one of the great teachings of Vatican II, participate directly in the mission of the church. We used to say that lay people participated in the mission of the hierarchy. In other words, were helpers of the ordained. Vatican II said no, that laity have a particular place, a direct place in the mission of the church. And they do this when they intentionally live as witnesses to the gospel in their daily lives. As parents, as teachers, as factory workers, as physicians. This is the exercise of discipleship, not ministry. But after Vatican II, there was, as some people have called, an explosion of ministries in the church at the level of the laity. Lectors, communion, or extraordinary ministers of communion, as we say. Marriage preparation teams, grieving committees, all these kinds of ministries just kind of evolved after Vatican II. And in the church around the world, there are millions of lay ministers, lay people who have been called, who have the vocation to do ministry in the church. However, over the years, another kind of lay ministry has begun to emerge in the church. And this is one of the most interesting developments, I think, in ecclesiology in the last, the last 25 or 30 years. My own church in the United States has dubbed this kind of ministry lay ecclesial ministry. And in 2005, our bishops in the United States put out a document, a very important document, I think, which is called Co-Workers in the Vineyard of the Lord. And what this document recognized, and I'm saying this is just one episcopate among many in the world, and I'm not sure if any have taken these same kinds of steps, but the bishops recognized a growing trend within lay ministry where lay women and men were working full-time for the church or in the church, that their salaries were being paid by the church, and that they were being more and more professionally prepared. And as they did surveys in a study that went into the making of this document, these women and men said, this is not just a job I have. This is a ministry to which I feel called. It's a vocation which I deeply feel that I have. Now, the bishops were very clear that this document is not the last word. It's not a mandatory policy for all the dioceses of the United States to develop these programs of lay ecclesial ministry. But it did say that what was emerging here is a new kind of ministry within lay ministry, but it's a lay ministry. It's not some kind of mini ordination, you know, that lay people are taking. It's because of baptism. And it's ecclesial in that these women and men are authorized by the local church for public ministry in the church. And it is ministry in the sense that not every lay minister can be called a lay ecclesial minister. These are positions of leadership in the church. So, for instance, my former student, Victoria Jung, runs the catechetical office in the Diocese of Hong Kong. I think she would qualify to be what we would call a lay ecclesial minister. She's a leader in the area of religious education. There might be, for instance, in some dioceses in the United States, there are lay women and men who are chancellors, canon lawyers who have doctorates or licentiates in canon law who work in the chancery office. I think they would be considered lay ecclesial ministers. It's not just lecturers or singing in the choir, but it could be, the director of music ministry in a parish or in a diocese or something along that line. And the document offers strict formation guidelines for those who prepare themselves for lay ecclesial ministry. It offers the same 4 criteria of formation that Pope John Paul II offered in Pastores Dabo Vobis, so that important document about priestly formation. The human, the spiritual, the pastoral, and the intellectual formation. All these 4 things go into the working of lay ecclesial ministries. Lay ecclesial ministers. Secondly, we can talk about the ministry of consecrated or religious life. And some might say, oh, is this really a ministry, though? Is this not really more of a state of life? Sometimes you hear that, and a lot of insistence on that. Ministry flows out of religious life. There's no religious life without some kind of ministry as such, but it doesn't constitute religious life. And I think there is a point here in that it cannot be reduced to ministry. Religious are not just what they do, but what they are. However, I think what religious are in the church offers a basic service or ministry to the church. In a document that came out about religious brothers in 2014, the document says that the first ministry, that's the words of the document, and then it quotes Vita Consecrata, Pope John Paul II's apostolic exhortation, to remind the baptized of the fundamental values of the gospel. And Pope Francis has talked about religious life as prophetic. It's a prophetic ministry in the church. And of course, religious life is expressed in three ways. In life in community, which is kind of the core value, I think, of religious life. The various ways that we can talk about vows or promises or oaths, however people express this, and then the particular charism of the congregation. Just being very, very quick here, and move on to the third aspect of ministry, which is ordained ministry. We know that in ordained ministry we have the three orders of ministry: episcopate and presbyterate, or priesthood, and diaconate. Our focus here, just for our purposes here, is on priesthood. And I think there's two aspects in talking about priesthood in kind of just broad terms. That the person who's ordained is ordained into a particular set of responsibilities in the church, and is given a particular kind of identity within the church and within the world. In terms of the new set of responsibilities, ordination makes the person responsible for the guidance, for the direction, for the order of the Christian community. That the ordained person is the orderer of the Christian community, or better, because we work with all disciples and all ministers, the co-orderer or the coordinator of the Christian community. The ordained person is responsible for the holy order of the church. I like to say, you know, that this is not just a noun, but it's a verb. That we're responsible for the holy ordering of the church, so that the church can be about the holy ordering of the world. And so the one who is ordained co-orders the church's worship, and is the one who presides, particularly at the Eucharistic celebration, co-orders the church's faith. At the episcopal level, of course, magisterium. At the presbyteral level, the offering of homilies, and the one who is responsible for the religious instruction of the community which he serves. And the co-orderer of the church's ministry, the one who's responsible that the church becomes a community of ministers and a community of active disciples who live out the mission of the church in the world. Pope Benedict XVI, in a talk he gave to the clergy of Rome one time, wanted to talk about the co-responsibility of laity and clergy together. He says this demands a change in mindset, particularly concerning lay people. They must no longer be viewed as collaborators. I think what he means here is helpers, you know, of the clergy, but truly recognized as co-responsible. There's a lot we could say about this, but if you take the discipleship aspect seriously, and you take lay ministry seriously, you know, you see the task of the priest is not just to lord over, you know, but is to really be co-responsible, to help the church as a whole to be co-responsible in ministry. And ordination also offers a new identity. And Pope John Paul II in Pastores Dabo Vobis and other places says this identity is the configuration of the priest to Christ as head, shepherd, and spouse of the church. In terms of head and shepherd, this means that the priest participates in the leadership of Christ of the community. The entire church is the body of Christ, All disciples are other Christs, or as Pope Francis says, Christ bearers. But the priest shares the headship of Christ over the church. But as Pope Francis says right away, this does not imply an exaltation that would set him above others, but rather leading the way Christ leads. The headship of Christ is a headship of deep and reverent service. Ordination to the presbyterate or any of the orders is not mere privilege. As Augustine said in that famous homily about pastors, for you I am a bishop, but with you I am a Christian. The first is a responsibility and a danger. The second is a privilege and a grace. You know, and I think we always have to keep that in mind. This idea of the priest as spouse of the church is not one of my favorite images of the priest. I don't know, I just find it a little, I don't know, I just, you know, I don't like it particularly much. However, when Pope Francis talked about the fact that priests shouldn't simply see themselves as functionaries, but as pastors, I think he's getting at something here. That the people belong to us, and we belong to the people. And so it's that kind of, you know, if you want to use that imagery, spousal relationship that the priest is ordained to, and that he's configured to Christ as the spouse of the church. Very briefly, in the last of the nesting dolls, I know I'm going a little longer. I'm sorry, we started off a little later too, so bear with me for just about 3 or 4 more minutes. God calls us all to a variety of ways to serve, either as disciples or ministers, whether as teachers or musicians or health ministry or social justice advocates or working in migrant ministry or retreat ministry or in liturgical ministry, whatever it might be. All of us are given these special gifts. And this kind of shapes the way we are human and we are Christian, and we live out our marriage or single state, or we live out our call to ministry. So I come then to my conclusion about, you know, the importance of cultivating a culture of vocation in the church. I think to understand where God is calling us, where God is calling me, or has called me, I think is to embark on a long journey to discover the heart's desire. And as our document on vocation from the Synod says, this takes a whole lifetime. And it really, you know, is an entrance, I think, into a cultivation, a culture. As the great Secretary of the United Nations back in the 1950s, Doc Hammarskjöld said, the longest journey that we can take is the journey within. And I think that, you know, as we enter into this culture of vocation, we need to engage in what Parker Palmer calls inner work. We have to work at cultivating our vocation. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to talk about various gardens that the auxiliary bishop of Green Bay, Wisconsin in the United States, a man by the name of Bishop Robert Morneau, talks about the cultivation of our gardens, our personal garden, our intellectual garden, our physical garden, our social garden, our spiritual garden, our technological gardens, and our aesthetic gardens. And that's the way I think that we develop, you know, we cultivate ourselves to be attuned to where God is calling us. But I think at the end, I think we can say with Doc Hammarskjöld, for all that has been, these wonderful graces in our lives, this grace upon grace, for all that has been, thanks, and for all that will be, yes. Thank you.